Greetings and salutations, friends. Jenny Lee here. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you're all doing well. And if you're new here, hi and welcome. And a big hello and thank you to all the new subscribers. Thank you so much. So today's case was a recommendation from a subscriber. So let's get into it. This is the Cookie Monster Killer. Disclaimer and trigger warning. The following podcast describes sexual violence, murder, and abuse of a corpse for mature audiences only. Just as an aside, this is not in any way related to the beloved Sesame Street monster who just so happens to love fruits and veggies, not just cookies. It's a whole thing, but rather of a man named Harrison Graham, born on September 9th, 1959 in Philly, PA. He was the oldest of 5 kids, and at an early age, he was already showing signs that he had a learning disability, which explained his low academic scores, and he had issues with discipline as well. He was forced to drop out of Olney High School in his sophomore year because he was failing so bad that he just didn't go to school. Eventually, in 1974, his mother would come out and say that he was diagnosed with a mental disorder and actually spent 2 years in a mental health care facility. But that can't really be verified, at least by me, partially because of HIPAA regulations. In the early 1970s, Harrison started working in construction, and in 1979, he moved out of his parents' house at 20, and he moved to a North Philadelphia neighborhood. That is actually described as being littered with crime and poverty. It is around this time that he started using drugs and alcohol and actually befriended pimps and sex workers. He was thought of as a gentle giant because he was quite tall, very athletic looking, and didn't display any violence towards anyone and had not been prosecuted for any violent crimes at this time. In 1983, he moved into a new apartment building that was mostly vacant. So he and the other tenants fenced off an area of the parking lot and used it as the spot to deal and use drugs. Over the next 4 years, Harrison would slowly turn his apartment into a drug den, and his friends would actually come by to buy drugs and party hard. I mean hard. Even through all this, he still never displayed any violence. He paid his rent on time, played basketball with local kids, and was just able to live off of his disability pension. But that's what people saw on the outside. That was the Harrison that he was presenting to the world. However, on August 9th, 1986, this awful smell was coming from Harrison's apartment. It was so bad that the other tenants had been complaining for so long to the landlord that he got evicted from his 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor at 1631 North 19th Street at about noon. Before he left the building, he literally nailed one of his doors shut to one of the bedrooms and told the landlord that he would be back later to pick up the rest of his stuff. Nathaniel Choice, the landlord, sent his grown son and his grown nephew to the apartment to start assessing any damage and, all that stuff. When they couldn't get into the nailed shut door, they peeked through the keyhole and got quite an eyeful and called the police right then and there. That afternoon, Officer Pete Scalanto arrived at the apartment building, one that was actually familiar with the police because they had been there earlier that week arresting someone for dealing. So Officer Scalanto walked up to the 3rd floor, and the odor was so strong that he could smell it before he even entered the apartment. He already had it in his mind that he was going to see a dead body right there in the entryway. Instead, what he found was piles, literal piles of garbage everywhere. Like, there were some as high as your waist. And I'm short, so that's probably up to my head. On one of the walls in the kitchen were expletives scrawled on it next to a crude drawing of a naked woman. and a smear that appeared to be blood. And at some point, there was a dog in the apartment because there was dried dog poop, which definitely added to the smell. Like, just everywhere. The men showed the officer the door with the keyhole, and when he looked through it, he saw the legs of a black woman. She was laying too still, so he was already assuming that this was the origin of the stench, like the main stench. Officer Scalano knocked on the door and announced himself, but there was no response from anyone in the room, and the legs didn't move. Soon after, an investigator with the medical examiner's office, Charles Johnson, had joined the officer, and together they pried the door open. The stench was overwhelming, so they put on masks to go further into the room. This room was also full of garbage and was waist high, but they were still able to see the woman's body and verified she was deceased and not wearing clothes. She was on top of a mattress that was on top of 2 other mattresses, so that's 3 mattresses. She had been dead for a while because her body was bloated, discolored, and had started to decompose. On the floor next to the bed was another woman's body that was also bloated. However, she was wearing clothes. Once they made the preliminary discovery, they put up the crime scene tape around the building and in the hallway and called for backup. If the big black medical examiner's van in front of the building didn't draw a crowd, the yellow tape would. They also called in homicide because while it wasn't unheard of for vacant buildings to be used for people to use as drug dens and would often sadly be where people would OD, but this didn't appear to be one of those cases. Detective James Hansen arrived on site and agreed that this looked like a murder. The whole apartment was a disaster. While looking through the moldy dog poop, old newspapers, magazine piles, smelly blankets, warped ceilings, peeling walls, and rotting garbage, they discovered a 3rd body at about 3:45 p.m. So this is roughly 3 hours and 45 minutes from when he got evicted. And she was wrapped up in 2 sheets and was buried under rags that were under the 2nd body. But his 3rd victim was nearly skeletal but still had some shreds of clothing on it. After tossing some broken pieces of furniture out the window onto the lawn, they found another set of remains that were mummified. Do you know how long it takes to mummify a body? Really fucking long. She was also wrapped up in sheets and under a pile of trash. Detective Hansen spoke to reporters and said, quote, "This could be the first time, to my knowledge, that we found 4 bodies of suspicious death in the same house," end quote. Because of the unusual state of this case, Detective Hansen called in higher-ranking officers because it was going to be a very long night. Medical Examiner Johnson called in for another medical examiner to the crime scene because of how unusual this case was unfolding. The 5th body was found at 5:30 p.m. They couldn't tell the gender at that moment because of the state of the skeleton, which had been sandwiched in between 2 mattresses. They were starting to wonder if the evicted tenant actually slept on top of the mattresses with the victims underneath it. As the hours ticked by, they had to bring in extra lighting because, well, all the windows had been covered up and boarded over by Harrison. If they took down all the coverings, it could have tampered with evidence. They didn't toss anything out the window until after it had been thoroughly inspected and cataloged. It was a very long process. As they worked through the mess, going from room to room, they found that Harrison must have resided in one room as his main sleeping area and the 2nd bedroom as his twisted mausoleum. At around 7:30 p.m., the 6th body was discovered inside a tiny 6-inch deep closet, sitting up, wrapped in a sheet and tied with white electrical cord. As the night wore on, the crowd outside grew as the word of bodies being discovered and body bags being removed from the building. After the sixth body was found, the police canvassed the rest of the building looking for any more bodies. Eventually, they did locate a molding canvas bag under a dirty mattress containing a leg and foot bones. The next day, Harrison's photo was circulating citywide to police districts, highway patrol, and special units. It was also in the next day's newspaper with a picture and the description that he was 29, 6 feet tall, medium brown complexion, and had lived in the building for 4 years. An arrest warrant was issued for him, citing, at the very least, abuse of a corpse. They talked to Harrison's mother, Lillian Jeter, who was 45 at the time, and she said she had asked him to leave her home because of his drug abuse. She did, however, tell them something they didn't know yet, that his girlfriend Mary was pregnant, but the baby had died on July 4th. When the police were interviewing the landlord and his fam about how Harrison was when he was evicted, they responded with, quote, "He didn't say nothing when I told him to leave. I heard him moving things around in there. I heard some banging noises like hammering." Remember, the bedroom door was nailed shut. They also said that when he left, he only took a few bags, a water bottle, and some clothes. He was wearing a striped jacket, white pants, a hat, and he was carrying his Cookie Monster stuffy. The more they talked to his friends, family, and neighbors, the investigators began building a profile to help in their search. Harrison liked to take long walks, play basketball with the local kids, as well as entertain them with his Cookie Monster stuffy. Others would describe him as a loner, but would get a bit crazy when he drank, like dancing in the street. Okay, I mean, who hasn't done that when they've had one too many? I mean, whatever. Immediately after the discovery in his apartment, and they had started doing interviews, no one was saying anything about him being violent or having aggressive tendencies. Eventually, there's always an eventually, otherwise we wouldn't be here. Eventually, several women would come forward claiming he had hit them on the head or tried to sexually assault them. I can't say the R word on YouTube or they will block my video. One of the women claimed that when she would go to his apartment for drugs, she thought the smell was from the toilet that didn't work and the piles of trash. So that's kind of understandable. I mean, why would you ever think, unless you're me, that somebody's hiding a body in their mattress? Once all the bodies got to the morgue, the painstaking procedure of finding out not only the genders, but the identities of the individuals. Some of the remains were in such poor shape, they couldn't even tell if they were male or female right away. The first two found were both black females that had only been dead for about 2 or 3 days. But because of the intense heat, remember it's August, so you got the heat and the humidity, the decomp had been accelerated. Both were in their late 20s to early 30s. One was completely nude, while the other one was wearing a sweater that had been pulled over her head. During the initial review of the bodies, there was no obvious cause of death, such as a bullet wound or bruising. By August 11th, it was determined that these two women were strangled. After the other autopsies were done, the medical examiner adjusted the time of death for those two to within the past 10 days rather than 2 days, or the 2 to 3 days. The older bodies were much more challenging, so much so that an anthropologist was called in to assist with reading the bone structure. It would also be harder to discern the cause of death. However, with the fourth body, they found a broken hyoid bone, which indicated strangulation. The parts in the canvas bag were identified as female. The last two autopsies were done with what little they had. They were found to be black women in their 20s, but it was impossible to find the cause of death. After hearing about what had been found in the apartment building, a woman came to the police asking if her friend had been located, who also lived in the building. Her name was Sandra Garvin, 30 years old, and had been missing for a few months. Within a few days of the discovery, 3 more women were suggested to be potential victims because they all knew Harrison and were all missing. One woman had been living with Harrison but hadn't been seen in 2.5 years. A man recognized the clothing from the second victim and thought it could be his wife. While crime scene investigators were sorting through all the junk in the apartment, they finally started to find things that could help identify the victims. 3 earrings, a ring, a heart-shaped earring next to the third victim's mummified remains, a crudely made ring, and a grid design earring fell off another set of remains. The items were published in the newspaper to help get leads on the identities of the women. They also brought in a forensic dentist, Haskell Askins, to help with identification via dental records. So one thing I learned while doing this research is that they don't need a full set of teeth to do a dental comparison. I always thought you needed to have your whole grill. That was my understanding. Every time they were like, well, we need their dental records. I assumed you needed the whole mouth to make a comparison. But Askin said, quote, we are looking for uniqueness that could be found in a single tooth or fragment of a tooth, end quote. He asked the public to bring in the dental records of anyone who they feared were missing and could be one of the unfortunate souls in the carnage of the apartment. His plea to the public resulted in getting 5 out of 6 matched because they had had dental work done. On August 15th, a human torso and skull were found in the basement of the apartment building, wrapped in a brown blanket and tied with an electrical cord. They set it off to find out if these remains were linked to the ones that were found previously on the roof. After a long manhunt, Harrison contacted his mother, asking her for food. She brought it to him, and she persuaded him to surrender to the police. On August 17th, Harrison Graham stood on the corner of a North Philly street while his mother told the police where he was. He was arrested and charged with 7 counts of murder and 7 counts of abuse of a corpse. They also took the clothes he was wearing because of the stains on his pants and jacket. His mother said that Harrison told her the bodies were there when he moved in and he didn't kill anyone. Pretty sure the landlord would have noticed that. Once they started questioning him and interrogating him, he eventually confessed. It was a slow progression with the confession. First, he only killed 2 of them. Then it was that he strangled all 7 while high on drugs. He acted very remorseful, and he was trying to straighten out his life. And he even offered up the names of 5 of the women. Robin DeSharzon, a former girlfriend, Cynthia Brooks, 28, Mary Jeters, Barbara Mahoney, 22, Patricia Franklin, 24. He didn't know the name of 2 of them, but one was Sandra Garvin, 33, because she came to his apartment looking for drugs. He strangled them during sex that he claimed was consensual. After they did the dirty, he claimed he would roll over and fall asleep, and when he woke up next to a dead body, it would always surprise him and freak him out. I mean, I'd be terrified if I woke up next to somebody and they were dead. Regardless of the circumstances, that's jarring. I wouldn't want that at all, ever. He said that this didn't start until January of that year and said, quote, it was just something that started to happen, end quote. And that he couldn't stop once he started because that's how murder is. It's like Pringles. His longtime girlfriend, Robin DeSharzon, who was 29 at this time, was his first victim. It is reported that in 1981, Harrison's mother told police that after he and Robin had an argument, she, his mom, visited Robin's apartment and witnessed Robin and her son, Harrison, doing drugs, and on a separate occasion, an acquaintance of Harrison saw him beat Robin. After he killed Robin, he panicked and didn't know what to do with her body, so he just left her body in the apartment. When he brought another woman home, he shoved Robin's body out onto the roof from his back window. Later on, he had a new live-in girlfriend that he told about Robin, and she admitted to seeing the body. She threatened to tell the police if he didn't get rid of the body. So he took the head and torso to another building and left the other remains behind in a bag. But before he did that, the body had started to attract, animals, birds, and they would peck at her body. That poor girl did not deserve that at all. None of them did. It took a lot of work and thinking outside the box, but finally in January 1988, his third victim was identified as Valerie Jamison, a 25-year-old mother of 2 boys. It took the incredible skill of forensic sculptor Frank Bender to map out the skull, flesh it out with using tiny rubber posts and brown modeling clay. When he was done, the likeness was publicized in the papers, and that is when an older couple that had reported their daughter missing saw the likeness, and they provided her medical records and found an odd characteristic on one rib that matched the 2. They also found a pair of her earrings next to the remains in the apartment that added to the evidence. While it's never the end of a story that a family wants, the confirmation that your missing loved one has been murdered or is dead, it's at least a step towards closure and hopefully healing. During their interviews, detectives were told that Harrison had composition notebooks that he used to make crude sketches of naked women with dismembered body parts and male genitalia on his breaks at work. The cops were actually surprised by Harrison. He was not illiterate and read the Bible daily, was a talented artist, and well-spoken. By the end of his interview/interrogation, he had a 10-page statement that had details for each murder and his feelings for each one. He kept insisting over and over that he didn't mean to kill anyone, and all the deaths were accidental, due to rough sex that included choking. Harrison was taken to his arraignment in his pajamas and slippers and was held without bail. His mental illness raised questions about his competency to waive rights to an attorney during his interview. He was then appointed a public defender, Joel S. Moldovalsky, and went into solitary confinement in the city detention center. Moldovisky. I'm not going to be able to say it right every time. So we're going to keep going. So, Moldovalsky, I can say it in my head correctly. Why can't I say it with my mouth? Okay. Moldovalsky discovered in his pretrial prep that Harrison was not given a public defender during his interview, and that Harrison was not even aware that he could ask for one during the interview process. Plus, there was a public defender in the building at the time of his interrogation. Also, Harrison had been handcuffed to a chair for hours on end. One detective of Harrison's rebuttals was that a public defender wasn't asked for because Harrison's mother was present throughout the interrogation. After the apartment was completely cleaned out of trash, no more bodies or remains were found. It was sealed up with tin sheets over the doors and windows to preserve evidence. A hearing was held on August 27th that lasted about 6 hours, and questions of his competency was on the table. Joel Moldovalsky offered testimony from 2 psychiatrists. Dr. Robert Stanton stated that Harrison had an IQ of 63, is below the consideration for being mentally competent, and added to that he was an abuser of drugs and alcohol, which would make it impossible to participate in his own defense. He also suffered from auditory hallucinations and blackouts. Another psychologist, Albert Levin, stated that Harrison couldn't read or write or tell time, labeling him as highly distractible. However, Dr. Robert Sardoff, who was hired by the DA's office, declared Harrison as competent saying, quote, "He was able to respond to my questions. He was able to give police a statement. He was coherent. It was logical," end quote. And thus, Judge Edward Meckel found Harrison Graham competent to stand trial and to be an active participant in his defense. In January, Harrison went for a neurological exam and imaging, and the report showed that there was no visible evidence of brain damage. But that didn't stop the defense from preparing for an insanity defense for the trial. In the pre-trial hearings, Harrison was found to be competent by 5 different court-appointed experts, and they all said that he was friendly, calm, and alert in their sessions, even exhibiting understanding of the legal procedures and that he was facing the death penalty. His level of understanding was more than advanced that even 2 of the psychologists even thought he was faking his attitudes and tics during some of the hearings in the court. They eventually stated his lucidity was due largely to the antipsychotic medication that he was now on while being incarcerated, which there's probably a lot of validity to that, because once a person is incarcerated, they get full medical, full dental. So if he's now incarcerated, which he is, he's getting the medical help he probably needed for a long time. On October 6th, Harrison pled not guilty to the charges, and when Judge Charles Durham asked if he understood what charges and what was happening, Harrison replied, "Nope," and started tapping his fingers on the bar in front of him, swaying back and forth, and was mumbling to himself. He also claimed that he didn't know where he was and that he just wanted to go home. I have a hard time believing it, because his defense the whole time was that he was mentally incompetent, and just because he had mental handicaps doesn't make him dumb or unable to understand what is going on around him. Handy-capable people are just differently abled, not disabled. After this show that Harrison put on, the DA called him out for it, and the judge entered the pleas and denied the request from the public defender, Moldovalsky, for an on-the-spot competency hearing, and the judge dismissed the request to drop the murder charges for Robin because her cause of death couldn't be determined. Remember, she was the one who was his first victim that was dismembered and scattered between 2 buildings that was on his roof. And because all of the identities of all the victims had been confirmed, the trial was set. During discovery, the prosecution admitted more than 100 gory photographs of the apartment and the victims. When Harrison saw the pictures, he chuckled and said, quote, "Those are the deeds of a very sick person," end quote. This pissed the judge off, and he told Moldovalsky to keep him quiet or, quote, "he may bury himself just by opening his big mouth," end quote. Medical examiner Charles Johnson testified about what he found in the apartment and showed pictures of each body, which the judge actually left the bench to come down and examine. This whole trial was a lot of unprofessional bickering between the 2 lead lawyers. The defense even tried to keep the press out, but that was dismissed. And Harrison was even heard saying that he was glad that the press was there, because then he could tell them how he was beaten during his interrogation into confessing to the murders. The defense even tried to say that all those bodies were just dropped there by others after those women overdosed, which makes no sense, because there was a building full of empty apartments that could have been used for that. It's not like they just went, "Hey, look, there's Harrison's apartment. Let's go give him some more bodies." That's not how that works, people. And I think you know that. Also, during the pretrial, the homicide sergeant brought in a few of the belongings that were found on Harrison when he was arrested, which included his Cookie Monster stuffy. When he saw it, Harrison said, quote, "I sleep with that. Can I have it back?" end quote. But it was evidence, so no. Harrison's mother and attorney convinced him to not have a jury trial because they said that the pictures from the apartment would be offensive. Duh. So the verdict would be left up to the judge. And because the judge had already seen and heard most of the evidence, it would be a shorter trial. During the trial, Moldavsky also used the defense for multiple personality syndrome, which is very hard to prove. He said that there were 3 personalities: Frank, the foul-mouthed drug addict that liked violence; Junior, who was a 2-year-old that loved Cookie Monster; and Marty, the handyman who was a mama's boy and that everyone liked, and the one who confessed to the police. On April 22nd, Moldavsky did his closing argument and left the defense as the women in the apartment may have died from drug overdoses or at the hands of others, and there was no way to determine how the bodies got there because they were quote-unquote discovered by the landlord's family members. He also reiterated the insanity of defense, insisting Harrison was on drugs and could have killed those women by accident. The rebuttal closing arguments from ADA King were that the defense's claims to be a work of fantasy and asked the judge to consider all the evidence and that no person could accidentally strangle 7 women. There were 2 women who testified against Harrison who actually dated him, stating that he had choked them during sex and even threatened one of them with a machete. On April 28, 1988, Harrison was found guilty on all charges and received 6 death sentences and 1 life in prison term. As a form of leniency, the court ruled that Harrison's death sentences could only be carried out after his life sentence was served, which basically means he'll never be executed. However, in 1994, a state Supreme Law clerk submitted the case for a standard review, and it was actually to be found that the sentencing was illegal. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court said that the sentence must be carried out, which immediately put Harrison at risk of execution, which must have been a hard thing for him because prison was the first time he had had any real structure. He became an ordained minister. That's an achievement. I don't care what your IQ is. That's an achievement. It's not easy to become an ordained minister, especially since they didn't have the internet back then, where you can't just pop onto a website and become ordained within a half hour like Joby Tribbiani. Shout out to all my friends, peeps. After many delays and motions from Harrison's legal team, we finally get a final determination that Harrison will serve a life sentence, and because of a law that was put on the books in 2002 by the Supreme Court that banned the execution of a mentally retarded individual, anyone who had an IQ that was lower than 70 would qualify, which Harrison did. On December 20th, 2003, 17 years after being sentenced, Harrison Graham was found to be too incompetent to be executed, and his life sentence would proceed. He is still alive and continues to minister behind bars. After the discovery in his apartment, the building was officially condemned for several code violations, and the few remaining tenants were ordered to leave. The Department of Health and Human Services gave them temporary shelter. So, Harrison Graham is known mostly as the Cookie Monster Killer because he loved his Cookie Monster stuffy. I mean, who wouldn't? It's Cookie Monster. But he had such a strong affection for it, he even had conversations with it, as his ex-girlfriends reported from the stand. I think he had it from way before he moved into that apartment, but it was one of those details that I was really curious about, but couldn't find anything conclusive about it. The other nickname he was given was the Corpse Collector, which is very accurate as far as nickname goes. I guess that wraps up this episode. I would have to agree with the judge that Harrison is definitely guilty, but those families will never get their loved ones back, so no amount of years sentenced is going to change that. Those women were whole people with full lives before any of this happened, regardless if they had substance abuse issues. I want to thank you for hanging with me today, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If there's anything specific you'd like us to go over, leave it in the comments below. I'll do my best to get to it. And remember, in a world where you can choose to do anything, choose kindness. Bye, guys.